Please welcome virtual speaker Dr. Kirsten Barnes, the expert analyst for the circular economy at the South African Plastics Pact.
Thank you so much, Michael, and it's really good to be here today. And we're going to move on from some of the, I understand in some circles whether Liverpool will win the Premier League is an important topic of conversation, but we're going to move on now to consider a really big question. And I want to look at why a circular economy for plastics in South Africa. So I hope to add some food for thought today as we consider this question for our plastic packaging sector. So a circular economy has become quite a buzz phrase in our landscape. So we see at high level in government and industry conversations and many different business models, there's a focus on circular economy currently. And circular economy has often been referenced as an environmental approach to address plastic pollution. And today I'd like to look at turning that on its head. And I've looked at two quotes from leaders, from business leaders, and I'd like to just introduce you to those before we get into some of the context for South Africa. So if we can move to the next slide. So the circular economy not only represents $1 trillion economic globally, but is a key part of the global solution to tackle plastic waste, address climate change, and restore the health of ecosystems. And that quote comes from Mark Bernaba, board member of the Reserve Bank of Australia and co-chair of See the Future. And then if we can move to the next slide, in a similar vein, from Keith Tufey, managing director and vice chairman and global co-head of sustainability and corporate transitions at Citi, a circular economy is key to building an economic system that is viable in the long run, in which value is created and maintained rather than extracted and wasted. So as you can see, both these quotes, they highlight the economic opportunity in a circular economy. So they put that front and center. And I think it's a very key element for us to consider in South Africa. So we see this emphasized from global heads of business, from global governments who are looking to plot their trajectory towards a circular economy. We see it reflected in policy and legislation globally. And we would like to consider, but what does this mean for South Africa? Is it the same in our context? So if we go to the next point, so will there be real benefits in our context? And then again, how will the transition to a circular economy for plastic packaging affect our GDP? And then lastly, will there be net job gain or loss? And these are very key and critical questions in our context. So if you can go back one, if there's very key and critical questions in our context for us to consider in terms of a circular economy in South Africa. So then there's been a recent study which has been funded by WWF South Africa and delivered by Pegasus Consulting and Circular Vision. And the study will be published very soon. So we're very thankful to the authors in allowing us access to the results of this study. And what the study considered is in modeling a circular economy for plastic packaging. So comparing the current linear economy trajectory and then modeling a transition to a circular economy trajectory, what might be the impacts for South African plastic packaging sector? So if we look at the modeling of a circular economy, what this model did was to look at reduction consumption of single-use packaging by 30% by 2050, and then the next point, a 50% substitution of virgin plastic for recycled plastic, and then the final point, scaled reuse refill models. So this was a computational general equilibrium model that was used. Sorry, if we can go back one, please. I will say next when it's time to move on. So if we look at the results of this model, it is a computational general equilibrium model that was employed. So this model focuses on a macro level on what happens to the economy. So modeling using specific instruments like taxes and levies to shift the economy, modeling what a transition might be. And they looked at 3 different transition pathways to 2050. And that was simply based on the time scale of the transition. So in terms of modeling the circular economy, these were the constraints and the aims by 2050 for a circular economy for plastic packaging in South Africa. So if we can move on to the next slide, and then the next slide. Yeah. So in terms of the modeling results, in transition from a linear economy to a circular economy in plastic packaging, The comparison with the business as usual, which is our current more linear trajectory in a circular economy, and what that might look like. We might increase some efficiencies in our linear economy, we might increase recycling rates, but the current trajectory doesn't look like a large-scale shift to a truly circular economy. And a circular economy is in which we really value our plastic resources. So we design and extract material and have our plastic products circulating through a maximum number of lifetimes in our economy. So if we look at the model results, if you go to that first point, the model trajectory showed, relative to a linear economy in South Africa, that we see increased economic activity in a circular economy in the plastics packaging sector in South Africa, with a cumulative GDP growth of 2% and an additional $7.2 billion in GDP growth by 2050. So that's relative. So it's an additional growth that we see in a circular economy for plastic packaging. And very importantly, the model results also indicate a 5 to 6% increase in both skilled and unskilled labor in the plastic packaging sector in a circular economy for South Africa. And we have to emphasize the trajectory in a circular economy that we need to take as South Africa is very much an inclusive one. We need to design people into our economy, and we need to think at the lowest skills level to address our socioeconomic development needs. So to me, what these results say is that if we entrench our current linear economy model, if we look to continue on the current trajectory where we just increase virgin plastic production, we're increasing the complexity of our plastic packaging and other plastic products, we might look to improve some waste management and recycling. But if we do that, we're actually planning to limit economic growth in our plastic packaging sector, and we're planning to limit income opportunities in that sector. So this is a very important result. And I'd just like to emphasize, although this is the first modeling study looking at a transition from a linear to a circular economy in plastic packaging in South Africa that I'm aware of anyway, we see very similar results from different modeling approaches globally, and that's across developed and developing economies. So these results should not be surprising in our context. So if we can move to the next slide. So we've had a look at this as the potential in a circular economy in plastic packaging, but it would be a good place to start to consider what is the state of circularity in plastic packaging currently. And this is a more detailed assessment than what we're presenting on the slide here, but this is an assessment of the current plastic packaging formats on the market in South Africa, so totaling 900 to 950,000 tons a year. And this data was verified by Annabi Pretorius and Plastics SA, as well as our SA Plastics Pack members, which includes our host Safripol and members across the plastics value chain, so including converters, brand owners, retailers, recyclers, and our key supporting members of PROs, Plastics SA, government partners, as well as in national government, as well as NGOs. So a range of different organizations have been involved in developing this information you see on screen. So if you look at the packaging placed on the market in South Africa, we can see we currently have about 48%, which is sitting in an adequate recycling bracket. So this is above greater than a 30% output recycling rate. So this is plastics that are actually recycled into other products. Just like to note that some of our Plastics Pack members point out that 30% isn't a good, or in some views, even an adequate recycling rate. But just that is where we currently sit. So there's good potential to increase those recycling rates, and particularly in our new mandatory extended producer responsibility regime that we find ourselves in. What is more concerning in terms of circularity is the plastic packaging that is currently sitting in the not recyclable and very poor recycling rate. So that's around 30% currently of the packaging placed on the market in South Africa. And there the formats look like multi-material flexibles in particular, looks like BOPP, flexible material used in labeling, etc., and other packaging. It looks like PVC packaging, polystyrene, including both EPS and HIPS, and currently also the PET thermoform. So as you know, PET thermoform, there's now a collection rate in South Africa by November of this year. There's a required collection rate of 9% of PET thermoform, and within 5 years, the targets in the EPR legislation require that to be above 30%. So in terms of a recycling rate. But that is a point of concern and needs quite some focus to further develop there. So in terms of where we're sitting in South Africa, we can see that there's quite some work to do in circularity, and we really need to look at certain interventions to be able to develop our circular economy for plastic. So if we can move to the next slide. So what are the circular economy opportunities we're considering? And then the next points under upstream. So if you look at us in South Africa, where we currently sit, in terms of aspects of the circular economy, we've really focused on end of life of our plastic packaging. So we focused on recycling. And what we've seen is a lagging recycling rate over the last 3 years. Obviously, COVID hasn't helped that at all, but there was a slight reduction in lag prior to COVID. And so what we've seen is a focus simply on recycling and waste management is not able to achieve circularity in plastic packaging. And that experience is mirrored from the most mature recycling economies globally all the way through. So this is not a unique experience. So we really, this shouts, we really need to look at upstream. So we really need to look at what material and what products are we putting on the market, and are we really valuing those products? So we need to think of a redesign for circularity. And where we see a specific economic opportunity is in reuse or refill models. Now, reuse refill models, what is meant here is where, for example, you take plastic packaging, so you take a detergent bottle and you go back to a retailer, a refill station, and you refill your detergent bottle with detergent. So we're talking about packaging that's reused for the same product. It can also be in certain models that you take a container that didn't previously have detergent in it, but you refill that bottle. What we're not looking at here is what is called a repurpose. So that's where, for example, you might take an ice cream or a margarine tub and put your kids' crayons in, or put your keys at the front door. So that is not what we're looking at in terms of reuse refill models. And I'll give you a sense of where that sits in the circular economy a bit later. So we're looking at opportunities in that. And then in order to maximize the economic opportunities in a circular economy, we need to look at design of our packaging for optimum recyclability for multiple use cycles. And what we've seen from producers and from certain design guidelines is that there's an emphasis on design for recyclability that only really looks at one additional lifetime of that packaging in the economy. So, for example, this might be an HD milk bottle getting recycled into a refuse bag. Sorry, that wasn't actually the best example here. I'm going to switch my example. So this might look like where you design packaging. So let's take a multi-layer packaging, a multi-layer, multi-material packaging. So looking at multi-polymer or an inclusion of other materials such as card, that can only go into products where there's a mix of those materials. So you won't separate those materials. Obviously, that might go into a plastic wood. In some cases, it might go into a construction element with a mix of mineral components. Those products at end of life, at end of their useful life, tend to be very low value and are often generally not recovered in terms of circularity. So if you're designing a multi-layer packaging that can only go into a plastic wood, you are designing for really one additional life. Even if that lifetime is a couple of decades, it's only one additional life. And in the lifetime of plastics that persist in the environment over hundreds of years, that can really be seen as a drop in the ocean. So we need to design for optimum recyclability. So designing so that your packaging at the end of life has the highest value, which means it's more likely to be recovered. We also need to look at design for inclusion of recycled content to access those economic opportunities in secondary plastic materials. So in materials that can get re-included. So, or that demand side, we need to design for that. So design packaging that can include, and design our processes that can include recycled content. So then if we move to the downstream opportunities, so if you go to the next point, and then again, we're looking at increasing recycling tonnages. So we can look at both supply and demand. So in supply, we need to look at additional recovery, separation at source for high quality material. So we often access material from very mixed sources, And Luanda very eloquently yesterday showed us the implications for reclaimers of recovering material that is very mixed from very mixed sources. We need to increase capacity in recycling plants. Currently not a barrier, but that will look like a barrier as we grow our circular economy, and then improving the quality of our recyclers. And just to note, this is very much linked to demand. So recyclers are unlikely to invest in increasing the quality, increasing wash plants and other techniques to increase the quality, getting specific lab capacity in plant if there's not that demand for the quality recyclers. And that's a very important aspect. And then we look at demand. We need to look at closing the loop, getting recycled content back into packaging. And I'll do a bit of a deeper dive on that a bit later. Also, another focus, what we need to look at is developing end markets for products with high value at end of life. So again, I'm doubling down on this. So what we see with some of our open loop recycling end markets. So this is where you get packaging going into a product which is non-packaging. So here's my HD milk bottle example. If we get HD milk bottles, they can be made into irrigation pipes for the agricultural sector. So that's an open loop market. That's quite a high value product. And if there's limited exposure to UV from sort of buried pipes, that can then be recycled back into irrigation pipes. So that's quite a high value product. What we see with some of our open loop markets is that there has been, or we're heading towards saturation in some of those. So we need to develop further high value in markets. And by far the largest proportion of the time, this does not look like products that include a mix of plastics or a mix of materials to maintain that high value. So if we can move to the next slide, we're now going to do specific opportunities in reuse refill, and then I'll go on to looking at specific opportunities in a circular economy for recycled content inclusion in packaging. And if we go to the next point to highlight, this is in the green box, which is coming up now. We will see this is the reuse loop that we're particularly talking about. So reuse looks like a very high value loop. So it's represented very close to the use cycle, and often there's a degree of authority and retained over that packaging, over that container as a useful resource, whether at the consumer or by the business, the producer, which is producing the product. So it's a very high value loop. And we generally get very high recovery of material, the packaging material, from these sort of loops. So if we go to the next slide. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2017 produced a report looking at the potential in reuse refill models. By shifting 20% of the weight of plastic packaging to reuse models, they estimated a $9 billion opportunity globally. And these are some of the packaging types that they recommended to reach that 20% by weight in the market. Now, if we look at the potential in the South African context, so we can move to the next slide, what we're considering is a different approach based in our context. We need to consider transition. And if we look specifically, and why we're specifically looking at this for South Africa, is reuse, as mentioned, is a very high value loop. It's noted as a very important component in the shift towards a circular economy for plastic packaging, and it's highlighted in a number of different studies and its usefulness in a range of different contexts. We see growing reuse targets which are legislated. So we have the example in France with legislated reuse targets, developing reuse targets in the EU, and we have Coke coming out with their 25% of beverages by 2030 to be sold in reuse models. And we see big retailers, for example, in the UK, there are a number of big retailers who have committed to reuse targets by weight of their packaging or by a percentage SKUs. So we see it really highlighted. And the Chilean Plastics Pact, which includes some of the biggest brand owners and retailers, currently has 8% of the packaging portfolio of Plastics Pact members in reuse models. So we're really looking to learn from that context. What we need to emphasize in South Africa is inclusive reuse models. If we look at a rapid scaling of some of the highly recyclable packaging in South Africa, so take PET beverage, if we look at a rapid scaling of that model, we design out a big section of the downstream value chain in plastic packaging. So that looks like our reclaimers, smaller SMMEs and collection up to the recyclers, and reclaimers and smaller collectors would lose a big proportion of their income by not having the PET beverage bottle available for collection. So how can we design inclusive reuse models? What does that look like? So if we move to the next point on the slide, what we're emphasizing is the SA Plastics Pact, and this has been the Coke approach in their refill bottles in South Africa, is to look where our markets in South Africa are currently far from recycling plants. So we don't currently have the business case to recover that packaging. So can we look at shifting reuse, refill in those locations so we reduce the amount of plastic supplied, where the systems in terms of waste management and recycling are generally not very effective to actually broken. So we're not recovering packaging for recycling from those markets. Can we shift to reuse, refill? And then if we go to the next point, the other aspect we're particularly looking at is on-the-go packaging, which is often highly leaked. Can we shift to reuse, refill models for on-the-go packaging, which is often not very recyclable, has a very limited recyclability in South Africa, and is often, as I said, leaked into the environment. And then the final point on the slide, looking at, can we look at where our packaging currently sits? If you go to the final point on the slide, currently sits in a low to a not recycled recyclability. Okay, there's been a bit of strangeness there, but where is it not recycled, or it has a very limited recycling rate? So what can we look at there? Now, if we look at, we don't have good data currently on the tonnages of on-the-go packaging. So what we're looking at in this next opportunity, if you go to the next slide, is opportunities, some of the low-hanging fruit, focused on locations far from recycling markets. What could we potentially look at? And here we're modeling this is 10% of the market in 2025 in PET beverage HDPs. Apologies, the slides projected from that side, there seems to be an overlap there. But we have PET home and personal care bottles, PP bottles and jars, PP buckets, HDP home and personal care, going from left to right, HDP drums and PET beverage. If we move 10% of the market, so we've modeled a 5% growth from 2019 to 2025, this is the tonnage we're looking at shifting to reuse. And if you go to the next point, you can see that two of these opportunities, there's a big business-to-business component. So that's in the PP buckets and the HDP drums, which could look like paints, edible oils, certain chemicals, bulk ingredients to the hospitality sector. And B2B, we consider as it can be very much a closed loop in terms of the product supplied. So there's quite a good opportunity in the business to business, and there's a limited contamination and risk is more limited in that cycle. So if we move to the next slide, what does this look like if we shift that? So here we modeled a reduction in plastic packaging production. So by a factor of 12, assuming that those containers are used at least 12 times, as well as looking at packaging recovery. So what we're looking at in reuse refill models is also to consider a mechanism to recover the packaging. So remember, these are areas we're looking at where we don't get good recovery or any recovery in some contexts of the packaging. So how can we incentivize recovery of that reusable packaging at end of life? And then if we go to the next point, the next slide, what we'll see is we have higher value in reusable containers. So the tonnages I've modeled there aren't accurate, because we'll look at higher value in the reusable containers. We need sturdier design. We'll see a reduction of 24,000 tons of packaging on the market and the recovery of an additional 1,300 tons for recycling. So assuming a 60% recovery. So if we move to the next slide, so that's looking at the economic opportunities in reuse. Now we move towards closing the loop. And if you can go to the next point. So this is the particular loop that we're looking at with the green arrow. So we're looking at including recycled content. So the packaging gets recycled back into packaging. And if we move to the next point. So what we see, so again, there's more detailed data behind this graph. And just to note, this was the initial data here was developed by the South African Plastics Target 4 Action Group, looking at recycled content back into packaging. Again, organizations across the value chain with key supporting members. And this only looks like formats where there's the potential to include recycled content. So in the polyolefins and HDPP, LD, This doesn't look like food contact. So what we discussed, and we've since checked, and this is also further developed under a World Bank funded study looking at specific circular economy opportunities in plastic packaging in South Africa, is we looked at technically what is feasible in terms of inclusion of recycled content back into very specific packaging and product combinations into those formats. And we also then looked at some operational feasibility. So you'll note here that although PET, particularly in beverage, can move to a very high recycled content, even 100%, we looked here at 25% given our barriers in supply currently in the PET. So what does this translate in terms of opportunity? So if we move to the next slide, we have an additional 63,000 tons of recyclate back into packaging by 2025. And just to note, this is not new. Generally, not all of it is new recycled content that we're considering back or into the recycling process. What a lot of this looks like is currently we have an issue where the quality of recyclate and the product it goes into, the quality of the product, are mismatched. So we have, for example, and again, I'm going to use my white HD milk bottles. So in terms of white HD milk bottles, we see a big proportion of that material currently going into carrier bags and refuse bags. We do not need the quality of an HDP white milk bottle recyclate going into carrier bags and refuse bags. That's a big mismatch. What we want to see is shifting that white HDP milk bottle recyclate into an HDPE home and personal care application. So that's what we're looking at. And very important to note that we need to start shifting that, and we need to see the demand to shift that. And then if we move to the next slide, if we look at the barriers currently in terms of achieving these opportunities in recycled content, and again, this was a discussion in the South African Plastics Pact Action Group, as well as further consultation in the World Bank study, what we came up with is that in terms of technology, that's both in the conversion and in the recycling, we don't have a technology barrier to include recycled content. We also don't really have a recycling capacity barrier. So not where we sit currently, we don't have a recycling capacity barrier. Where we see the two biggest barriers to inclusion of recycled content are in supply, and that's particularly in the PET, and then in demand, and that predominantly sits in the polyolefins. So if we focus on the polyolefins, and this is the particular drive that we are, or focus area in terms of SA Plastics Pact and what we're recommending in the World Bank study, is we currently don't see demand from brand owners to include recycled content at the scale we need. And if we look at, there has been some increase in demand. So since we've seen the institution establishment of our extended producer responsibility regulations with collection and recycling targets, we've seen some producers make the link in the polyolefins, between them achieving their collection and recycling rate targets and their own demand for recycled content. So we see in the polyolefins, we don't have sufficient demand to pull material through the system. And where that big gap sits is in closing the loop. So producers specifying recycled content back into their packaging. And some have made that link, and our recyclers have communicated that they have seen increase in demand under our new EPR and mandatory regime. Also, what we've seen more recently with the devastating Ukraine crisis is that we see increase in virgin oil prices, and again, our recyclers have communicated an increase in demand. Also, what's interesting from, again, what is communicated is that once producers and brand owners have the approval process, have the material approved to include recycled content in their packaging, they're looking to sign offtake agreements for up to 24 months to secure that recycler to go back into their packaging. So I think in the polyolefins, HD, LD, PP, we can learn from our PET journey, where the early movers in including recycled content back into PET packaging have now secured their recycled content. So PET has a recycled content target in the EPR legislation. Those early movers have secured their recycled content to include in their packaging. Those that move late are now scrambling to get access to recycle it. And we're seeing the same thing develop in the polyolefins, with the early movers being able to gain access. So in conclusion, if we move to the last slide, and the first points on that slide is that if we want to realize the opportunities in circular plastics, we see that there's no single organization, and the next point, no single sector that is able to achieve circularity on their own. And I think a really good example is in the inclusion of recycled content. And what we see with being able to achieve recycled content inclusion in packaging and to push those recycled content higher, starting from low and moving higher, is that we see excellent partnerships between the converters, the brand owners, and the recyclers to achieve that. So it's a very important component of our move into circularity is collaboration, and something we see in our SA Plastics Pact action groups, where we have perspectives given and really good insights from across the plastics value chain so that we can drive progress towards circularity. In terms of the drivers, if we look at the first point, currently seen and mentioned quite extensively, extended producer responsibility as a driver for circularity. Just to note, in our extended producer responsibility fees, there is a requirement to calculate fees based on ease of recyclability, which is an eco-modulation. So what that means is that the less recyclable or the unrecyclable packaging in South Africa should attract a very high EPR fee, with the most recyclable packaging having a lower or a low EPR fee. We currently don't really see that in the proposed EPR fees, and that will change as our EPR system develops. So we expect, or we will be seeing, we need to be seeing, because it's in the legislation, that eco-modulation, that incentive to design and put on the market packaging that is easily recyclable, and that we'll see that instituted. And reuse targets are present in the legislation, currently only populated for glass, but given the drive we see globally, we expect that there will be reuse targets at some point in our EPR legislation. And then if we move to the next point, so what we see in terms of export markets, particularly have engagement with our fruit export markets, they're under quite some pressure to design a packaging that is compliant with the circularity goals and aims, both legislated and from specific retailers, that they're under pressure to comply with those circular economy aims in terms of packaging. And we see increasing amongst the Plastics Pact network countries and other initiatives also in Africa. So we see Senegal, Kenya, also now Ghana and Nigeria under a World Economic Forum Plastic Action Program regime. So we're also expecting the African Circular Economy Network is supporting the African Circular Economy Alliance, which is a ministerial alliance looking at driving a circular economy across Africa. And we know of studies, for example, looking at the potential in trade interventions to drive a circular economy for plastics in Africa, and particularly looking at our potential regional circular economy for plastics in Southern Africa. So we do see quite some moves on the African continent. And then the next point, with the recent UNEA meeting and the mandate now to develop a global legally binding treaty to address plastic pollution, where circular economy is highlighted as the approach to do so, this will also include harmonized standards. We have a global plastics value chain, a global plastics market. So we'll see harmonized standards, which will again put pressure on and incentivize us to access economic opportunities in a circular economy for plastic packaging. And then moving on to the final point, and I close with this, is that we have the opportunity to position business to create and maintain value in a circular economy. We see modeling studies locally and globally indicating an increased economic opportunity in the circular economy for plastic packaging, as well as income opportunities. So we see on the macroeconomic scale, there is this potential in a circular economy, but how are we going to position ourselves to access those economic opportunities and to realize the value in our own businesses and organizations? Thank you so much for your time and attention today.